Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us reach more people like you. And now, a daily exploration into how philosophy, psychology, and technology shape how we think, feel, and live.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Something is happening in the space where governance, meaning, and public language used to converge. It is not collapse exactly, nor is it reform. It is quieter, more ambient, a reconfiguration of systems that continue to function but no longer explain themselves. Decisions are made, policies are announced, institutions remain in motion, and yet a growing dissonance persists between what is seen and what is understood, between what is said and what is meant. This dissonance is not incidental, it is structural. Across domains, the familiar tools for making sense of civic life, debate, consensus, accountability, reform, feel increasingly inadequate to the realities they are meant to navigate. Language still circulates, but its reference drift. Participation continues, but its terms are obscured. What remains is a sense that something essential has shifted, not only in what governance does, but in how it is perceived, interpreted, and sustained. This essay begins there, in the gap between appearance and architecture, between continuity and coherence. It does not propose solutions. It traces conditions. It asks what happens when systems persist without meaning, when public life is shaped less by intention than by repetition, and when the frameworks we inherit no longer match the realities we inhabit. It is not a map. It is a calibration, a quiet attempt to register a change already underway. The narrative of decline that dominates public discourse today is often mischaracterized as national, economic, or institutional failure. In reality, it reflects a broader structural transition in how modern societies organize belief, distribute authority, and interpret meaning. This is not an argument for repair, but a mapping of reconstitution already underway. And what is often described as the collapse of public trust or the erosion of democratic ideals is better understood as a systemic epistemic shift, a movement away from shared civic imaginaries toward fragmented, affect-driven governance. Across regions, ideologies, and media systems, the traditional functions of statehood, coherence, planning, representation, have been restructured. Institutional legitimacy is no longer tied to outcome or integrity, but to performance under conditions of ambient crisis. The role of governance has shifted from constructing futures to managing volatility. Legitimacy, once grounded in procedural rationality or collective aspiration, now resides in the ability to appear responsive to a public whose expectations have been individually outsourced and algorithmically mirrored back. This transformation is not confined to one geography or tradition. The loss of a shared epistemic commons, the capacity for a society to agree on the reality it occupies, is occurring globally. What replaces it is not apathy, but a proliferation of privatized realities, a world in which public sense-making has been externalized to platforms and citizenship reduced to reaction. Under these conditions, common purpose is not merely elusive, it is structurally precluded. If systems remain legible only to themselves, civic authorship collapses into passive receipt. We do not suffer from a lack of language, but from its inertia. Words remain. Structure has moved on. Conventional political analysis often mistakes these patterns for dysfunction, policy failures, partisan gridlock, leadership deficits. But this framing misses the deeper reclassification at play. Systems are not simply breaking down. They are being repurposed. Visionary politics has been replaced by risk management. Reform has become an aesthetic posture. Centrism operates not as a site of balance, but as a buffer against disruption. Moderation is not a virtue, it is a suppression field. The effective cost of this shift is misread as disillusionment. In truth, it marks a recalibration of what people expect from the civic world. Hope is no longer structurally supported. It is now privately maintained, individually sourced, and culturally aestheticized. Trust functions more as nostalgia than belief. And yet, the machinery of public life continues to operate, largely to maintain the appearance of continuity. This is not a call for chaos. It is not a rejection of form. It is a demand for systems that acknowledge their own epistemic burden. To diagnose this moment is not to declare failure, but to name a reordering. Societies are not descending into chaos. They are adapting to a new logic of meaning production, one that prioritizes optics over structure, emotion over explanation, and modular governance over long-term vision. Recognizing this does not resolve the crisis, but it does clarify its nature. The centre is not holding because the conditions that made it intelligible no longer exist. And in that absence, the work begins, not of recovery, but of reconstitution. If the centre no longer holds, it is not because competing extremes have torn it apart, but because the centre itself has been redefined out of existence. What was once a space for negotiation and coherence has become a placeholder for inertia, an empty category used to defer confrontation. The centre was never neutral. It was a procedural artifact, engineered to absorb contradiction without transforming it. This structural evacuation of the centre is one of the most consequential shifts in the modern political landscape. It is not visible through party alignments or polling data. It is visible in the widespread inability to imagine transformation as a collective, coordinated act. Moderation, once the architecture of durable governance, has been recoded as a form of passive containment. It is not about temperance, but deflection. In the current schema, to be moderate is to manage noise rather than address contradiction. Consensus, if it emerges at all, is engineered through saturation, an overload of equally inadequate options that simulate balance through exhaustion. This is not centrism as prudence, it is centrism as narrative quarantine. This redefinition of moderation introduces a moral confusion. Performative balance becomes more virtuous than structural clarity. In effect, contradiction becomes a reputational liability only when it interferes with the simulation of harmony. The emotional labour of appearing calm, reasoned and above the fray now outpaces the civic labour of shaping consequence. This shift has profound implications for public reasoning. In place of vision, we find calibration. Instead of orientation toward shared futures, we see institutional reflex conditioned by media cycles. Strategy has replaced ideology not because ideas have failed, but because strategy can operate without belief. It is modular, real-time and emotionally efficient. It performs responsiveness while evading structural commitment. What leadership looks like has replaced what leadership does. The political class has adapted accordingly. Leaders are no longer judged by coherence or clarity, but by their ability to stay legible in a system that rewards volatility, signals that confirm, soothe, or intensify pre-existing effective alignments. The substance of governance is subordinated to its semiotics. At the epistemic level, this manifests as the breakdown of proportion. Small actions are amplified as signals of virtue or betrayal. Large failures are absorbed into ambient cynicism. The calibration of public perception becomes the primary task of political communication. There is no scale of consequence, only cycles of attentional capture. This is semiotic inflation, a condition in which signals proliferate while structure decays. This is not a failure of politics, it is its current function. Governance has become the real-time management of perceived instability. Underneath this function, deeper changes persist unchecked, not because they are invisible, but because they are disarticulated from consequence. Long-term trajectories, economic precarity, ecological collapse, institutional drift, are not denied, but decoupled from political narration. The present absorbs all bandwidth. The centre does not hold because it is no longer built to. Its disappearance is not a crisis. It is an outcome. What remains is the appearance of deliberation without the conditions for decision. The challenge is not to recover the centre, but to interrogate what it was meant to hold and who it excluded to do so. The loss of a shared epistemic commons is not an ancillary crisis. It is the primary operating condition of contemporary governance. Across systems and territories, the capacity to produce consensus around basic realities has degraded. What replaces it is not chaos, but a controlled diversification of truth environments, each calibrated to a different effective economy. This fragmentation does not merely complicate public discourse, it renders it structurally inconclusive. In this informational ecology, what is considered real becomes a function of rhythm, not verification. Publics do not so much agree on facts as they synchronize responses. Belief has been replaced by attunement, meaning when it appears is not derived from deliberation but from the simultaneity of effective reaction. The result is emotional simultaneity without ideological coherence. Systems continue to operate, not because their logic is shared, but because their tempo is collectively mimicked. This shift reorganizes institutions at their core. Decision-making bodies increasingly rely on performance metrics disconnected from lived experience. Models replace judgment. Sentiment replaces deliberation. Legitimacy becomes a function of visibility, measured not by outcomes but by the ability to occupy narrative space. Institutions persist not because they continue to function, but because they continue to signify. Political actors in this environment are no longer architects of policy but curators of perception. Their success is measured by their fluency in symbolic compression, a gesture, an image, a phrase that travels. Authority is secured through resonance, not resolution. This produces a politics of implication, of atmosphere over analysis. Coherence is no longer pursued through argument, but through effective shorthand. What emerges is a civic field organized less by coordination than by synchronization. Synchronization substitutes for solidarity. Public response is not anchored in understanding, but in the timing of its release. The circulation of outrage or reassurance achieves system-wide effect without system-wide comprehension. In such a regime, velocity performs unity. Participation becomes reaction, and reaction becomes governance. Institutions adapt accordingly. The future is no longer a site of construction, it is a projection surface for ambient anxiety. Institutions do not offer trajectories, they offer updates. This undermines not just strategic thinking but the plausibility of collective anticipation. Hope becomes an act of selective unawareness. To continue investing emotionally in the civic domain requires detachment from its structural logic. None of this signals the end of governance. It signals its adaptation. The new condition privileges coherence of affect over consistency of logic, and retention of attention over distribution of understanding. The system does not collapse, it floats, detached from the burden of shared reference. The challenge, then, is not how to rebuild consensus, but how to operate without it. This is not an invitation to relativism. It is a recognition that collective meaning must now be constructed without preconditions, and that systems designed to ignore this reality cannot claim to govern it. The displacement of vision by strategy marks a pivotal turn in how institutions relate to time. Long-term political imagination has receded, replaced by an ethos of perpetual adaptation. Governance, once tethered to ideals of direction or trajectory, now functions within a closed loop of responsiveness. The future is no longer a site of construction, it is a risk category to be managed, deferred, or gamified. This is not a rhetorical shift, it is procedural. Institutions plan in quarterly increments, campaigns in news cycles, citizens in pay periods. The compression of political temporality displaces structural thinking in favour of temporal liquidity, fluid, reactive, and buffered from cumulative responsibility. Decisions are increasingly optimised for delay rather than consequence. Strategy outperforms vision not because it is wiser, but because it is safer within volatile information environments. This procedural logic erodes public memory. Narratives that once unfolded across decades are now compressed into trending moments. As consequence detaches from chronology, accountability dissolves into abstraction. The public registers crisis as atmosphere, not sequence. There is no before or after, only a rotating field of urgency calibrated to perception. Historical learning becomes a casualty of structural drift. Language, in turn, is reprogrammed. Words such as transformation, reform, or future retain their syntactic roles but are emptied of forward reference. They signal ambition while operating as placeholders. Rhetoric moves ahead of reality, creating a buffer of semantic surplus, where contradiction accumulates without confrontation. This is not semantic confusion, it is design. The gap between political language and structural condition is engineered. Within this schema, contradiction is not resolved. It is metabolized. The system does not collapse under tension, it absorbs it as content. Policy no longer mediates conflict, it stylizes it. The imperative is not to act, but to be seen acting. Strategy becomes a vehicle for movement without transition, change without trajectory. This is not inertia. It is engineered stasis. Futures, accordingly, are modelled but not imagined. They appear as probability fields, not aspirations. Governance does not pursue transformation, it forecasts turbulence. and power consolidates around those who can model fluctuation. Analysts, platforms, prediction markets. Those who ask what the future should be are sidelined, not because they are wrong, but because they are illegible within strategic time. This is how vision is disincentivized, not by censorship, but by the removal of narrative architecture. The crisis is not the absence of ideas. It is the absence of any framework in which those ideas could endure. The system does not oppose vision, it outpaces it. And until we recover the capacity to sustain ideas across time, not just across cycles, governance will remain fragmented, reactive, and post-imaginative. The emergence of resilience as a civic virtue marks a subtle but consequential shift in the moral architecture of governance. Once associated with adaptability and communal strength, resilience is now increasingly invoked as a proxy for institutional withdrawal. It reframes structural absence as individual capacity, turning systemic precarity into a test of personal fortitude. What appears as praise is often displacement of responsibility, of repair, of obligation. Resilience, in its current deployment, is not about recovery. It is about tolerance. It does not imply transformation, but endurance. It asks people to remain operational within degraded systems, to cope with failure rather than confront it. In this way, resilience becomes a euphemism for managed abandonment, a virtue constructed to postpone demand, a mechanism for displacing accountability onto those least empowered to claim it. This rhetorical shift becomes most visible in conditions of institutional retreat. Where social infrastructure decays, the language of resilience proliferates. It provides a grammar for absorbing collapse without acknowledging it, a way to narrate suffering as strength and exhaustion as dignity. The moral economy of governance is thereby restructured, not around justice or responsiveness, but around the aesthetic of composure. That aesthetic is not neutral. Resilience becomes an emotional standard, admired, expected, enforced. It narrows the spectrum of acceptable public feeling. Rage is undisciplined, grief is inefficient, refusal is illegible. In their place we find the celebrated figure of the calm citizen, unbothered, enduring and quiet. This is not emotional maturity. It is affective compliance. These dynamics are not accidental. They reflect the strategic logic of effective governance, where emotional comportment is politically meaningful. In this regime, resilience is not merely encouraged, it is tracked. Emotional tone becomes data. Calm publics suggest functional systems. Agitated publics signal instability. The emotional surface becomes a proxy for legitimacy, even when the underlying structures remain unchanged. Thus, institutions become optimized not to prevent harm, but to measure how well harm is tolerated. The guiding question is no longer what caused this, but how are people adapting? This disables critique. It frames suffering as inevitable and turns response into a diagnostic instrument. Reform becomes reaction time. Crisis becomes character test. To question resilience is not to belittle the capacities people develop under duress. It is to ask what those capacities are being made to replace. When resilience becomes a default policy response, it ceases to be a virtue and becomes a shield against structural redesign, against ethical accountability, against the redistribution of care. A system that celebrates resilience without investing in prevention is not virtuous. It is evasive. The task then is not to eliminate resilience, but to resituate it, not as the apex of civic virtue, but as a signal that repair is overdue and that endurance should not be the price of belonging. The erosion of the epistemic commons has also produced a corresponding collapse in the architecture of consequence. In earlier civic models, actions, political, institutional, rhetorical, occurred within a shared framework of memory and accountability. There was an assumed continuity between what happened, how it was remembered, and what followed. Today, that continuity is broken. Cause and effect have been decoupled. Responsibility is ambient, distributed, and frequently unclaimed. This is not just a crisis of enforcement. It is a structural feature of fragmented meaning systems. When narratives are disaggregated and reality is encountered through personalized feeds, the ability to trace consequence, let alone assign it, diminishes. Contradictions do not discredit actors, they coexist with performance. Violations do not terminate authority, they are metabolized as content. Public memory in this schema becomes a residue rather than a record. It is no longer a civic archive that informs collective judgment. It is affective sediment, what lingers emotionally, not what survives as fact. Events are recalled not for what they changed, but for how they felt. Outrage is remembered, not outcome. The emotional valence of the past displaces its informational function. This distorts the threshold of violation. When consequence is inconsistently applied, it becomes unevenly distributed. Scandal is no longer rupture, it is routine. Apology is not reparation, it is choreography. The mechanisms once designed to process contradiction, deliberation, investigation, reform are overwhelmed by symbolic noise. Institutions absorb critique without reply, recalibrating optics instead of content. Velocity substitutes for substance. Systems maintain legitimacy not by resolving tension but by circulating signals. This is governance by motion, updates, appearances, gestures. Meaning is displaced by rhythm. This is not administrative failure. It is a mode of system survival in a condition where shared judgment cannot hold. The public response to this condition is not outrage, but exhaustion. Where trust once enabled participation, fatigue now permits detachment. Cynicism becomes a rational adaptation to performative politics. People still act, vote, protest, but increasingly without conviction that action leads to consequence. The civic imagination becomes inertial. It expects to be ignored. This is the deeper crisis. Not that action is futile, but that the connection between action and effect has been obscured beyond recognition. A society that cannot process consequence cannot learn, and a system that cannot absorb meaning cannot evolve. It can only circulate. Restoring consequence is not merely about accountability, it is about making systems interpretable again. Without shared frames of memory, proportion, and temporal coherence, civic life continues in form but not in function. The task is to reconstruct not just institutions, but the narrative conditions under which they can be believed, challenged, and changed. The erosion of shared consequence has led not only to the decline of belief in governance, but to the deterioration of the very concepts through which governance is imagined. Words like trust, justice, solidarity, and even democracy remain in circulation, but increasingly as atmospheres rather than structures. They no longer describe operations, they signal affiliations, they function as emotional shorthand rather than institutional commitment. This is not linguistic drift. It is infrastructural decay. As institutions fail to deliver on the meanings these words once invoked, the words themselves lose traction. What remains is saturation without weight, civic vocabulary used so frequently and with such divergence that its reference hollow out. Language floats detached from function. What was once descriptive becomes decorative. The same holds for metaphors. The centre, the future, the dream, these once anchored political imagination. Now they persist by inertia. They no longer organise possibility, they obscure it. Their invocation postpones conceptual revision rather than enabling it. In the vacuum of structural coherence, metaphors become scaffolds of delay. This disjunction is most visible in the domain of repair. Institutional repair depends on more than political will. It requires conceptual legibility, the belief that systems can be named, understood, and intervened upon. When that belief fails, reform ceases to be a proposition. It becomes a performance, not a commitment to change, but a gesture of attentiveness calibrated to displace agency. We do not suffer from a shortage of commissions, audits, or initiatives. We suffer from their inability to mean. Thus, the civic space fills with simulations of reform, statements of concern, symbolic consultations, committees without authority. These are not failures in a procedural sense. They succeed at maintaining legitimacy through circulation. They are operationally functional strategies of stasis, yet this dynamic creates its own contradiction. As metaphors and terms continue to be invoked without operational grounding, a gap opens between language and experience. People are not confused because they are uninformed. They are disoriented because the tools they are given to interpret the world no longer match the systems they live within. The result is conceptual dislocation, a political condition where the real becomes structurally illegible. In such conditions, critique cannot begin with new programs. It must begin with new metaphors. Until we find language that corresponds to current conditions, language that does not merely signal but explain, orient, and revise, there will be no coherent ground on which to build alternatives. Description precedes transformation. The task is not only to name what is broken, it is to invent a language adequate to the brokenness. Only then can political meaning re-enter the field of possibility, not as nostalgia for lost coherence, but as architecture for future interpretation. The absence of viable metaphors is not a stylistic concern, it is a conceptual emergency. Societies do not think in statistics, they think in images, in analogies, in scaffolds that hold complexity without requiring resolution. When those scaffolds collapse, governance does not simply lose its elegance, it loses its meaning. Without shared metaphors, systems cannot be critiqued, alternatives cannot be conceived. Public language drifts into performance, and politics becomes an ambient simulation of structure. This is not just a communication failure, it is a foundational obstacle to political cognition. Metaphors are not decorative, they are operational. They shape what is seen, what is questioned, what is believed to be possible. The exhaustion of civic metaphors, progress, balance, stability, leaves a conceptual vacuum. In that vacuum, mood rises where maps once were. Anxiety replaces agency. Nostalgia replaces design. What emerges is not silence, but recursion. Institutions speak in terms they no longer inhabit. Words circulate with historical momentum, but without contemporary location. Governance recycles its vocabulary faster than it updates its function. The result is not simply misalignment, it is symbolic fatigue. A state in which public has to commit to structures that cannot explain themselves. This breakdown does not only confuse, it distorts ethical reasoning. When metaphors of purpose vanish, so too does the distinction between obligation and optics. Care becomes branding, inclusion becomes a signal, responsibility becomes choreography. The appearance of moral alignment substitutes for material redistribution. Symbols proliferate in place of structure. Meaning becomes optional. This crisis cannot be resolved by reviving old metaphors. It requires the cultivation of new ones, new symbolic architectures capable of hosting contradiction without collapse. These must be metaphors that do not hide complexity, but make it intelligible. They must orient without simplifying, invite interpretation without coercing agreement. Without them, systems become perceptually closed, even if procedurally open. To critique a policy now is to operate in an interpretive vacuum. Every proposal can be reframed. Every failure can be rebranded. Every outcome can be narratively neutralized. This is not institutional drift. It is narrative exhaustion. The real danger is not authoritarianism. It is semantic exhaustion so profound that any regime can claim coherence by merely occupying language. A system that cannot name what it does cannot govern what it is, and a public that cannot imagine otherwise cannot demand it. The reconstitution of civic life must therefore begin with the reconstruction of conceptual life. Before platforms, before policies, before coalitions, there must be metaphors. Not borrowed ones, not inherited ones, but new scaffolds of meaning that match the structures we now inhabit. Only then can language reconnect with structure, and only then can governance begin again as something more than motion. The task of conceptual reconstruction cannot proceed through critique alone. It requires a shift in institutional posture from defensive continuity to intentional reconstitution. Most systems today operate under the assumption that their legitimacy is intact, that their challenges are external, and that with sufficient optimization, normalcy can be restored. But the problem is not friction, it is foundation. The architecture itself no longer corresponds to the conditions it was built to serve. This misalignment is not episodic, it is systemic. Institutions, governance, education, finance, media continue to function, but increasingly without symbolic consent. Their persistence is mistaken for coherence. What endures is not belief, but infrastructure, mechanisms that remain active even as the narratives that once justified them decay. The result is governance that is operational but illegible, technically intact, conceptually incoherent. To repair such systems is not to restore them, it is to recompose the very terms by which they allocate value, access, and consequence. This requires more than reform, it requires epistemic humility. Systems must not only diagnose their failures, but question the frameworks through which failure is perceived, interpreted, and validated. Without this recursive capacity, reform becomes repetition. This work cannot be outsourced to policy specialists or procedural experts. It must be participatory, but participation itself must be redefined. Under current conditions, public input is often structured as affirmation. Choices are pre-narrowed, language is pre-coded, and disagreement is preemptively domesticated. A politics of reconstitution would begin by reversing these structures. It would invite uncertainty. It would tolerate contradiction. It would refuse premature closure. It would not begin with the question, what should we do? It would begin with the more foundational, what can we no longer assume? It would recognize that many of today's most persistent crises are sustained not by absence of will, but by the persistence of systems that are still treated as the instruments of their solution. The core constraint is not dysfunction. It is the false belief that legitimacy can be recovered from within the frames that obscured it. Reconstitution is neither restoration nor revolution. It is the slow, deliberate design of systems that do not pretend to be neutral, complete, or permanent. Systems that make visible their own assumptions. Systems that welcome revision. Systems that embed responsibility not in their optics but in their operations. Only under such conditions can language begin to reconnect with the experience of being governed. What follows is not a blueprint. It is a proposition that the future of political meaning depends not on louder declarations of principle, but on quieter, deeper shifts in how we construct, interpret, and revise the very frameworks through which collective life is made possible. What becomes possible when systems acknowledge their own discontinuity is not merely institutional redesign, but a shift in the ethical foundations of public life. Contemporary governance often assumes that stability is a precondition for responsibility. But in an age defined by epistemic fracture, emotional volatility, and conceptual exhaustion, responsibility must be reimagined, not as the preservation of form, but as responsiveness to conditions that no longer fit inherited models. This redefinition begins with perception. When the coherence of the world is no longer guaranteed, noticing becomes political. To notice what systems erase, what language omits, and what routines conceal is not sentiment, it is epistemic intervention. In this context, critique is not a mode of opposition, it is a form of diagnosis. It names the space between what is said and what is lived. Such naming does not resolve contradiction, it makes contradiction available for action. That is where political work now begins, not in proposing solutions, but in illuminating the conditions that make action legible. Without this clarity, activity becomes simulation, effort that performs urgency while reproducing stasis. Simulation does not merely distract, it exhausts. Reconstitution begins in practices that reconnect language to structure, affect to analysis, power to accountability. These practices are not always institutional. They may arise wherever dissonance is held without erasure, where systems are interrogated not for weakness, but for mismatch. They do not depend on consensus. They depend on conceptual fidelity, the willingness to hold complexity without collapsing it into resolution. Practically, this means designing systems that reflect their own contingency, systems that measure not just performance, but relevance. That track not only outcomes, but their interpretability. Governance must be evaluated not simply by efficiency or reach, but by its responsiveness to what is newly visible, what was previously unspeakable, unreadable, or systematically disqualified. This also requires an evolved conception of the public. The public can no longer be assumed as a singular legible field. It must be understood as plural, uneven, sometimes incoherent. Reconstituting civic life does not mean forcing agreement. It means designing infrastructures that can host contradiction without collapse. Only in such architectures can disagreement function generatively, not as rupture, but as input. The demand is not for perfection, but for intelligibility. A system that can be interpreted, questioned, and revised is one that can be trusted, even when its outcomes are contested. Rebuilding that trust will not come through spectacle, sentiment, or symbolic appeasement. It will come through the slow, disciplined labor of constructing forms that can survive their own scrutiny. This is not the end of governance, it is its resumption, under conditions of epistemic honesty. Systems do not merely need to function, they need to mean, and to mean they must be open, to critique, to contradiction, and to redesign. That is the work that remains, not to return to coherence, but to make complexity governable again. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode was digitally narrated by Holly, who helps bring our ideas to life. And thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. They help us reach more people like you.